Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. I think the invitation came from work I've been doing alongside Andrew Sherry, who will be very well known, of course, to all of you. A project that the Department for Environment and Climate Change came up with called PUNE, which was the Public Understanding of Nuclear Energy. From time to time, governments suddenly get the idea that we've got to do something new to persuade the public radiation's a good idea and nuclear power's a good idea. And they pretty much always end up doing what we've always done in that area, which has been noticeably unsuccessful in my mind. So what I'm going to suggest is that a couple of preliminaries. Firstly, what would be great would be if we could go back to, say, 1975 or 1970, rerun the whole of society, just changing one of the variables that I'm going to talk about here, and see whether that was actually the key factor. Unfortunately, there aren't really the resources to do that in most research projects that I'm aware of. But it does mean inevitably that there's, although I was a scientist by training and at Imperial to begin with, but this is much more impressionistic, and therefore, in a sense, I think more challenging to try and pick out the sorts of themes that are going on. A corollary of that is that usually I find when I've done a talk like this, at the end of it, I reckon I agree with about 75% of what I've just said. And the rest of it is kind of work in progress. So, and one of the reasons I changed my mind is that I get great questions and great challenge, which I'm very much looking forward to. Nonetheless, the starting point is a relatively simple question. Why is the safest large-scale energy source we have yet come up with regarded as being the most dangerous by significant numbers of people, indeed in some countries by enough people to result in nuclear power either never starting or being closed down once it had started, or not developing in the way that it actually could? That is not a rhetorical question. I'm putting that forward as a genuine question. Generally, I find when chatting to folk in the nuclear industry, it's a kind of rhetorical question. It's a kind of, we'll wring our hands, isn't this awful? Without actually, strangely for scientists and engineers, without actually trying to get to an empirical answer as to what might actually be going on. First, just a couple of comments, probably not required for a room like this, but yes, it really is the safest of the large-scale energy sources we have yet come across. A huge amount of work by externi in Europe, that clearly in Europe excludes the accidents at Chernobyl and Fukushima, but they actually make very little difference when averaged across the number of megawatt hours or terawatt hours that have been generated by nuclear, show very clearly that the dangerous ones, this excludes any damage done by climate change. So this is just on the direct attributable acute deaths associated. Fossil fuels really pretty dreadful, certainly oil and coal. Gas much less so in terms of direct effects. But then right down the bottom there, the low carbon sources, which also happen to be the safest. Interestingly, more or less the same graph with coal and oil switching places is the fact for climate change as well. So when you add climate change in, you amplify the effect, not reducing it. But this is just the attributable short-term ones. A NASA paper in 2013. One of the co-authors being James Hansen, who, until he made the mistake of saying that he now thought nuclear power was a good thing, was one of the great gurus of the green industry. He is almost single-handedly regarded as being the person who brought climate change to the attention of the US Senate with a speech in 1988. So someone with some pretty powerful green credentials. But their estimation, and it did, if you read the paper, it's certainly heavily caveated, but their middle estimate was that certainly they reckon they could justify that the use of nuclear power rather than the fossil fuels we would have used in that period of time saved something like not far short of 2 million air pollution related deaths. We reckon there's something of the order maybe of 7 million early deaths a year because of air pollution from use of fossil fuels, ignoring all the other health effects. And something like 64 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. And then, depending upon your assumptions about what nuclear would be displacing, you can come to a range of figures, but maybe 7 million over the next 4 decades with a major new nuclear programme is something which could be justified. Chernobyl, undoubtedly there were off-site health consequences from Chernobyl, the only one where that's demonstrably the case. The best estimate is that there was something like 50 deaths on site, 30 immediately, and it looks like possibly around 20 excess deaths among the liquidators and those others who were directly involved. Something like 6,000 thyroid cancers, with about 10 fatalities from that, but that is very clearly, undeniably, an effect of the accident. There's been some very useful statements from UNSCEAR, the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, over the course of the last 3 or 4 months, where they're starting to come to a definition to move away from this rather crude argument about if radiation has the same proportional health effects right down to a 0 dose, then there have been 4,000 deaths, or there will be 4,000 deaths as a result of Chernobyl, but we'll never know. They're tightening that to say now that statements like that really are probably meaningless, and you would only come to a conclusion if there were, firstly, if it was one of the diseases you knew was associated with radiation, and thyroid cancer very clearly is associated with radioiodine, and if there is a very clear increase in that particular disease in the population you're looking at, and again, this absolutely fits the bill. So no doubt at all about the thyroid cancers, a great deal of doubt about how meaningful that 4,000 early deaths because of the accident, not least, for example, that we're making great strides in the treatment of cancer and issues of that nature. But anyway, the kind of analogy is, when I was shaving this morning, I cut myself very slightly. I'm sure if you added up all of the blood that men, mainly men, I presume, I don't want to be sexist about it, but mainly men shaved this morning and added that up, my suspicion is that that would probably be enough blood, if taken from 3 or 4 individuals, to kill them. So the argument is that we have a hidden tsunami of deaths caused by shaving in the United Kingdom because of this thing. Now, actually, I have great difficulty, I have asked a lot of people, finding any biological insult that does follow a linear no threshold model. The assumption is that benzene does, and the assumption is that asbestos does, although those are, the more I dug into it, like radiation, those are assumptions for designing things. It seems to me inherently unlikely, apart from anything else, that if radiation was that dangerous, and we know there are vast variations in natural levels of radiation, we'd probably have evolved some mechanism of being able to detect it. We've evolved some pretty good mechanisms for avoiding environmental insults that are damaging for our health. We haven't with radiation, and it seems to me suspicious if it was that dangerous that we wouldn't have evolved, that those of our ancestors who were able to detect it and evacuate Cornwall or whatever would probably have had an evolutionary advantage. Anyway, leaving all that to one side, even taking the 4,000 at face value, between 90 and 99 there's some 85,000 short-term, absolutely discernible deaths associated with technological disasters. The biggest accident in energy history by some way was the collapse of the Bankyo hydro dam in China in 75. Various estimates, but 170,000 is a common one. 26,000 direct deaths from flooding, and then within 2 or 3 months almost 150,000 more from the disease and the starvation that resulted. To put it into perspective, the 2.5 million are the urban city air ones. 7 million is the total probably. And yet, during Fukushima, some foreign nationals were actually evacuated from Tokyo, thereby getting a much bigger dose from the air flight that took them back home than they would have done had they stayed there. Indeed, if you were just looking at short-term or long-term health effects, you could make a much bigger argument for evacuating the population of Tokyo into the exclusion zone than the other way round, because they would avoid the challenges to the city air of a city like Tokyo. I live in Tooting in inner London. My life expectancy is around 9 months less than that of my parents and my sister and her family who live in rural Leicestershire. And yet nobody has forcibly evacuated me from my home in inner London because of the threat that I'm facing. We'll come back to this because that is what has actually happened. We might question here whether that was sensible or not, but that is what has actually happened, that evacuation. And I'll suggest that's a major reason, or a major possible partial answer to the question that we're considering. Because another way of restating that first question is, what was it that turned Fukushima, which in actual technical terms was a middle-ranking industrial accident of the kind that I guess happened maybe 8 or 10 times a year, every year, somewhere in the world, into a major human disaster. About a year ago, studies came out suggesting that the number of deaths among the evacuated population from stress-related illnesses, from suicides and the like, had now exceeded the number of deaths in that population from the earthquake and the tsunami. So the evacuation, none of those deaths from radiation, of course, but the evacuation itself has been a bigger threat to health than the earthquake and the tsunami. These are interesting academic questions. They're also questions that have enormous influence on quality of life and indeed, in many cases, on life itself. The general sort of nuclear family, if I can use the term, the industry, its supporters and so on, it tends to be a kind of, as I say, a sort of hand-wringing, oh dear, I mean, there's an irrational fear. The word irrational almost always comes in the course of this. There's an irrational fear of radiation. Somebody, it might be the media, it might be the Green Movement, but someone is obviously going around misinforming people about radiation, and that's causing fears. And in effect, all we've got to do, when we're in dialogue with the media, with the public, is tell them, no, it's really not as dangerous as you thought it was, and everyone will cheer up and support nuclear power, and there'll be dancing in the streets and everything. In an odd sort of way, I think someone has been going around telling people that radiation is more dangerous than it actually is. I just don't think it's the people that the industry think it is. So, is it fear of radiation? Well, no, because actually, if you look at radiation from almost any other source apart from nuclear power, and people don't seem to be in the least worried about it. Here is just a selection of those who have died, and these are short-term radiation deaths. There's been perhaps 100, just over 100 deaths from the short-term effects of radiation, acute radiation syndrome, since the end of the Second World War. And of that 100, 30 at Chernobyl, or 28 of those 30, I think, were from acute radiation syndrome. Actually, accidents in nuclear submarines and overdoses of radiation in medical uses are the two biggest categories within that the category. And then a sprinkling of others, 5 murders using radioactive material and so on. You see Mr. Litvinenko is in the news again today. So I say, here's just a selection of those. Almost all these are from medical uses of radiation, either getting out into the environment or, say, overdoses. I think all these are cases of radioactive material either being stolen or being left behind when a facility is closed. But we have got Mr. Litvinenko there in 2006. Those don't seem to have any long-term panic associated with them. Very little sign of radiophobia. The Litvinenko issue, in London in 2006, you could find quite decent doses of polonium-210 in taxis, in restaurants, in hotel rooms. No radiophobia, because of course this was a KGB story, it wasn't a radiation story, so nobody actually took the trouble to tell people not to be worried about this polonium-210, so nobody was worried. If it's not mentioned as a possible source of worry, then of course people aren't going to be worried about it. Thank heavens nobody went around and said don't worry about these levels of polonium-210, because then we might very well have seen significant public panic. This also, I mean, clearly the same is about radon in houses. When the Old National Radiological Protection Board was trying to get people worked up about the levels of radon in houses in Cornwall and Devon, It just got nowhere. People refused to be worried about radon. Again, they probably made the mistake of not telling people that it was safe as it was. That would probably have set a few suspicions going in people's minds. They actually went around specifically telling people it was dangerous, so people said, no, it's not. We've lived here for ages. I don't know of anybody who's suffered from this. Air travel and so on. But this also, because of this, it also rather knocks the sort of second one of saying, well, it's man-made radiation that people, or radioactive materials that people are afraid of. Because actually all of these, in effect, were from man-made sources of radiation of one sort or another. So that's the first simple answer, I think, which is challengeable, was actually there is not a generalised radiophobia in the population as far as I can tell. It seems to be specifically in the context of the use of power. Now, going on so much about safety, EDF, safety is the top priority, is EDF's corporate message. Well, what on earth does that mean? No, it isn't. Making electricity is the top priority. The top priority is to make electricity economically and cleanly. Of course we want to do it safely, like every industry does, but that's not why we do it. There's actually a very simple response. If safety is your top priority, very easy answer, just stop doing it. Then you can have as much safety as you like if you don't do it. But again, after Fukushima, there was a whole range of people saying this must never happen again. Now, you don't get that in other industries. I particularly followed some of the criticism of BP after the Gulf of Mexico, where a lot of the green commentators were actually seriously criticising BP for not saying we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Well, actually, the reason that they're not saying, I believe that the reason they're not saying it won't happen again is, firstly, it will, and they know that. But secondly, when we say it mustn't happen again, we're implying that if it did happen again, it would be something which the planet could not recover from. We all know that oil spills are very unpleasant. We also all know that oil spills put themselves right. It might take 2 or 3 years, it might take a decade, and those are clearly things that you wouldn't want to happen, but they don't threaten the planet. The planet is quite capable of dealing with that. Well, of course, I believe exactly is the same is the case with radioactive releases from an accident like Chernobyl or Fukushima, but that's not the way those in charge of the industry talk. There is this dialogue about it must never happen again. We're heading for perfect safety. And the very fact that that is your stated goal, I think, sets up the idea this is in a different league in terms of danger from anything else that we do as a species, because nothing else we do as a species has folk going around saying we must make sure an accident is impossible. So, radiation and nuclear material are uniquely hazardous, seems to be the underlying message of that sort of language, in my view. No other industry makes great play of dropping packages onto steel from 30 metres, and you get these nice pictures of it. Nothing else talks about burying its waste in mountains or several hundred metres underground. As far as I know, we were chatting earlier that maybe there are 1 or 2 industries that do, but I certainly haven't heard about it to the extent that I think is regularly heard about with radioactive waste. The industry quite often says we're going to go beyond regulatory requirements. Well, what sort of subliminal message is that saying? Even the industry doesn't think the regulators are tough enough, so there's nobody actually looking after your interests. So basically, a single serious accident would actually be a damaging event. You can understand why it is so difficult for people to understand that there have been no radiation deaths from Fukushima, because that's just not consistent with what was said about it beforehand. We've got to make sure it's impossible, and what's been done about it subsequently. And I'll come back to that. But broadly speaking, I don't like anything which has the word irrational in it as an explanation. I don't believe that, because that means uncaused. I believe the public perception of radiation might be inaccurate, but I don't believe it's irrational, given the information which is available to them, not least through their own eyes. So, public kind of response is quite often, these people are just a bit strange, the way they come and talk to me. They seem to go an awful lot about their machines and what their machines do, but perhaps a bit less about community environment. That's something which has changed a lot, I think, actually, in the right way, and I'll come back to where we actually are on public perception in the UK, but I'm sure you're well aware of it. one thing, safety obviously can't be guaranteed. Everybody knows that things go wrong, particularly through human error. And actually that is perfectly correct. The next major nuclear accident will probably not be because of a pressure operating relief valve sticking, or because of a positive void coefficient and someone running the machine on very low power, or because of an earthquake and a tsunami knocking out your emergency cooling pumps. We've, I think, learnt those lessons, and those accidents won't happen again. But something else will, and it'll be something else at least as unlikely as those particular events. And so the public view out there is saying, so actually, we know accidents will happen. The important thing is how serious is the accident when it happens rather than its frequency. And the way these people talk, they're really telling me that if it did happen, that would be of enormous consequence. And therefore, it's something I really ought to be a bit concerned about. Against that, I think you're creating a background which is the exact opposite of what you thought you were creating. I think when it comes to the rationality of the industry, which is broadly speaking, if I make things a bit safer and I tell people about it, they'll cheer up a bit. And the rationality of the public, which is, if these people are telling me it's a bit safer, they've had to make it a bit safer. It was obviously a bit more dangerous than they used to think it was. And what's more, what's going to stop them coming back in a few years telling me it's even more dangerous, which of course is exactly what the nuclear industry has done for 50 years in continuing to say this is the next way forward. People are now saying the next generation of nuclear plants we build in the UK will be much safer than the previous ones. They'll be much safer than no deaths at all in 50 years. What does that cannot be the message. That message is so irrational. It must mean, well, probably there's quite a lot of deaths they're not telling me about, or alternatively they're barking mad, which of course is the true explanation, but is a bit less likely given general sort of human experience of things. So Churchill said something along the lines that when someone was trying to persuade him of a point of view, first he'd look at who was saying it, then he'd look at how they were saying it, and then he'd look at what they were actually saying. That was very much the third in the way of saying. I'll suggest that actually there are exceptions to that, and sometimes what is being said is important, particularly when what is being said simply doesn't make sense in terms of what people know is actually happening, and that I think is a history of nuclear communications for an awful long time. There's kind of three broad assumptions, I think, behind the kind of industry approach to risk. First is that people get worried because they see things to get worried about. So something is going on, that causes people to get worried, and then if you can either make it go away or persuade them that it wasn't so worried, then people will actually cheer up. Secondly, as I say, every time something's made a bit safer, people will be a bit less worried about it. And thirdly, if we give people accurate information, that will make their perceptions more rational, even if those messages actually don't make sense. And that's kind of what I was worried Pune was starting from. This broad idea out there that the real problem with nuclear technology is that still a relatively small proportion of the people have degree-level physics, health physics, biology, economics, and all the things you would need to even begin to get a sense of how complex the nuclear debate actually is. And there's it's a deficit model. There's something wrong with the public, and therefore we're going to have an open two-way dialogue at them until they realise their mistake and start thinking sensibly. And I don't think that particularly works. So an alternative argument is actually most of us live our lives at a fairly constant level of misery, whatever is going on around us. I did a talk, funny enough, at Cambridge just 2 or 3 months ago, and one of the students there came up with he's called it the law of conservation of misery, which I really liked. That broadly speaking, for each of us, I mean, of course, in the short term, that's not the case. But largely speaking, there seem to be some folk who can take anything in their strides, and it doesn't matter what's going on, they still have the same sort of approach. There are others who can get massively worked up about the smallest thing. I know I can get hugely worked up about where I've left my keys until something serious happens. Then I get worried about that. But actually, I'm not sure I'm any less worried about the serious thing than I was about finding my keys. So, in practice, risk perception and risk perception management might be better analysed in terms of what we're doing is finding, we have this level of anxiety and finding excuses in our environment to justify it. Actually, again, evolutionarily, that doesn't sound to me all that unlikely. It seems to me those of our ancestors who were always anxious, always looking around for what it was that was about to eat them, or what it was that was coming into their environment that they could eat, probably got more of an evolutionary advantage than the kind of hippie Neanderthal man who just lay around and let life pass them by and took a very relaxed approach to. You can sort of see how that might reduce the likelihood of their genes being passed on. So at times of real threats, and I think this is true for us as individuals but also of societies, I think, funnily enough, we do seem to see that the other sorts of threats take a much lower profile. Durkheim, in his great work on suicide in the 1880s, which started what was one of the first works of sociology, refers there, and there's quite a lot of statistics since then have followed it up. For example, during both the First and Second World War, that suicide rates do seem to be lower at times of wartime than they are at times of peace, which is an interesting observation. And what's more, when there's something really nasty going on, a war or massive economic collapse or whatever, the anxiety that we've got is kind of a bit cleaner. It makes sense to us that we're anxious because these dreadful things are going on. When we get significant periods of societal comfort, affluence, not much going wrong, we still feel anxious. We're still trying to find something to be anxious about. But the things that we find, we kind of recognise are not quite such good candidates as we had there. So there's a kind of second level anxiety, an anxiety about the anxiety. But nonetheless, we do succeed in finding things like mobile phone masks and measles and mumps and rubella vaccines and genetically modified organisms and mad cow diseases. Things that are pretty high class problems in terms of our evolution to get extremely worried about, and low level radiation is one of those. So we succeed in finding these things to be concerned about. And what the interesting question might be then, and it's something I've sort of thought about but haven't personally got round to doing some work, but I think it would be interesting, is more, what makes a good candidate risk for people to hang their anxieties on, to blame their anxieties on. Now, one of the things I think would be there is that the messages just don't make sense. A kind of sense of what's going on here just doesn't fit with what I know, so that might be a good candidate to get worried about. I think it's high profile, particularly if someone keeps coming and telling you how low a risk it is. I suspect that's probably going to give you a pretty good reason for being worried about it. Relevance, seeing how the risk might impinge on me. I think there's a cost-benefit element to it like that. I think the representatives looking a bit alien to the way we live our lives. There's also some really interesting work done by a school in Oregon, Slovic, you may have heard of it, from the late 70s, early 80s, who looked at a range of risks and found that for risks of the same absolute size, we tend to overestimate them if they are new and unfamiliar to us, if they are out of our individual control, and if they are likely to affect a very large number of people, particularly people in the future. And as it happens, those three factors, nuclear is quite close to the edge of that. But coming back to that, I think it's possible to critique there that should be just the same about radiation from other man-made sources, but it doesn't seem to be. And so I think Slovic's work is fascinating and a real contribution to the debate. But it doesn't seem to me to be sufficient to explain that particular difference when it comes down to it. So, can we make a case to say that the public, including media, are the rational ones and it's the industry which is irrational? Well, let's look at a few examples. NIREX, the waste agency, used to go around saying intermediate level waste is about as dangerous sort of petrol or paint stripper. You could do damage with it, but if you deal with it carefully, it's not too bad. Then go on to say, in fact, it's so safe, we're going to bury it 800 metres underground in areas where there's no groundwater, where what groundwater there is moving at a slower rate than a centimetre a century. Well, when the groundwater does move out of the site, the material will tend to get absorbed onto the rocks rather than moving with the solvent front, and where there's no seismic activity. And you sort of think, well, and the rational, the industry view is people are going to be really cheered up by that because we're taking this massive care over something that isn't all that dangerous in the first place, I'm not sure. I think anybody who actually did believe that are probably the ones who could benefit from a visit from the men in white coats, because the rational response from the public point of view, I suspect, is firstly, this must be the most dangerous stuff we have ever created, because we haven't got this same programme of burying most chemical waste and so on that deep underground, or certainly the industries involved in it don't take full-page adverts, as Nirex used to do, about what they intended to do with it. So we should be scared. And what's more, if at the same time they're telling us this isn't very dangerous, they're obviously insulting our intelligence, because that just doesn't fit in with what they are telling us they intend to do with things. I often reflect that at the same time as Nirex was taking these full-page advertisements about waste management, I don't remember British Airways or its predecessors taking full-page ads out saying, if you get on one of our aeroplanes, it's very unlikely the wings are going to fall off because we do all this non-destructive testing around it. It tended to be more, if you get on one of our planes, we will take you to Tahiti and you will have a really lovely time. But there seemed to be this sort of technocratic view of saying, no, the way to really get people on side is to explain to them what's being done, while at the same time say, and it's not really all that dangerous at all. Safety is the top priority I've already touched on. We've got a thing called RIMNet in this country. I went across to Hong Kong after Fukushima. They've got a similar version where they can detect extremely low levels of radioactivity in the environment. And a few days after Fukushima, they announced publicly that they'd been able to detect the material. It took them another week to calibrate it because the levels were so low, but after another week they came out and said, we've discovered this is 1/54,000th of the level at which we need to be worried about. And with the assumption that people will say, oh, that's all right then. Well, again, I suspect the human rational response is, so you are telling me you have spent an absolute fortune designing something and detect something which is 1/54,000th of the level where I should get concerned. If that is true, then you are crazy, and I'm not going to let you anywhere near a single cent of my money in the future. Far more likely, though, actually, is you know jolly well this stuff is dangerous. That's why you've set this up, and you're just lying to us when you say that it's not actually a problem. But either way, it's impossible to come up with a rational belief or a rational explanation, or to believe an argument that actually says what is the truth, which we know is actually they have spent a vast amount of money setting up a system that can detect this stuff at ridiculously low levels. Over 100,000 people still can't return to their homes near Fukushima after nearly 4 years because we're erring on the safe side. That erring on the safe side, I think, is the single most damaging phrase in the whole of this, because it is impossible to argue that they have erred on the safe side if the outcome has been that more people have died because of their actions in erring on the safe side than were actually killed by the earthquake or the tsunami. If nothing at all had been done, then there would probably have been some radiological consequences. Not much, maybe not detectable, but certainly doses would have been higher, and particularly I suspect we might be seeing some thyroid cases. But the cost of erring on the safe side has been unimaginably dangerous and unimaginably cruel, I think, to the populations involved. Both because of what's been said beforehand in building up the fear, and then in forcibly evacuating people from areas that are vastly safer than most of the areas they were evacuated to, certainly if they had ended up in Tokyo or another major city. So, people are seeing our lives have been destroyed. The lives of the people who were evacuated have literally been destroyed, in the case of the more than 1,000 in the prefecture who have died early. But even for those who have been taken away from areas, it's quite a rural area, it's agricultural, it's fishing, but those people have been taken away from those backgrounds, much more serious than it would be for someone like me who's lived in 6 or 7 different places in my life. If I had to leave London, it'd be sad because I love living in London, but nonetheless it would be nothing all that different from what I've done before. That's not the sort of population we're talking about here. They've been uprooted from their whole social and cultural network and placed elsewhere and refused permission to go back to their homes. Actually really compounding this now is that in those areas where they have decided to allow people to go back, they're now saying you have to go back or we'll withdraw your benefits. And so suddenly these places become, people are expected to believe these places have become safe overnight, so safe they're now being forced back into them. Extraordinary mixture of I think rather cruel approaches in my view. They set a level of 100 becquerels per kilogram on food after the accident. The international limit is 500 becquerels per kilogram. Means that some food which was perfectly safe to eat before the accident became dangerous, not because of anything that had gone on in the accident, but because they lowered it, simply because they'd lowered the limit. Again, the thought was, we'll be reassured by this. Well, were the regulators allowing us to eat dangerous food before this accident? Why were they doing that? Do I really trust them to look after me now? And furthermore, this was a time when the Japanese government was making great play of the international help that it was getting, talking to the best people in the world to deal with the aftermath of the accident, yet at the same time they're saying, but we don't trust the international community levels, so the people we're bringing in, we don't think they do their job well enough, but nonetheless we're making great play of doing it. I'm not saying every single individual picks up every one of these, but when they're all taken together, it's creating an image which is so far from what's being said in the communication that it becomes impossible, I believe, for any rational person to actually believe what they're being told. So there needs to be a serious reality check on the common sense interpretation of what's actually going on and making sure that some of what's being said, but even more important, what's being done, doesn't seriously clash with a common sense view of that. Human psychological rationality has been extraordinarily effective in getting us to where we are as a species. We are extraordinarily good at, usually, in most circumstances, of knowing whether something works or doesn't work, of knowing what to trust and not to trust. Not perfect, because there are professionals who deliberately try to mislead us in that sense, but nonetheless we're extremely good at that. And actually, I have to say, at the end of the day, I would trust human and psychological rationality before I would trust technical rationality when it comes to putting these messages together. One case study, I went across to the Japan Atomic Industry Forum conference early last year and gave a sort of session. I have to say these messages didn't go down all that well, I'd say, but one speaker on the platform was bemoaning that the Japanese public didn't realise that man-made radiation was the same as natural radiation. There was a kind of ripple of laughter in the audience about how stupid people are not to realise that. And so obviously the Japanese just needed a huge effort to correct the misimpression, go out and explain to people this, and then nuclear power would be more acceptable, programme of educating the media and so on. Well, what does the well-informed Japanese member of the public actually know, or at least what's in the public domain? First and foremost, they know these people were evacuated from their homes forcibly. I should perhaps say I'm not criticising the evacuation while the accident was happening. I think getting people out of the way, both to find out work out what was happening, and to give the operators more freedom when it came to, say, venting the inner containment when they needed to, without worrying too much of doses for people living nearby. That was perfectly sensible. I have no objections to that. And leaving people away from the site for 3 weeks, maybe even 3 months at an outside, I could listen to the argument for that. Not 3 years, though. There was nothing happening really after 2 or 3 months that we didn't know about on there. From that point onwards is where I really have the problem with it. So people knew that they've not been allowed back into their Daiichi, not Daini, were not allowed back into their homes, and yet the graphs were being published showing contours. Certainly after a year, most of the exclusion zone was outside the 1 millisievert a year contour. Most of the zone was giving less than a millisievert a year thing. They also know, or the educated Japanese would know, but it's certainly very easy to get at, that there are areas. Ramsar is perhaps the most famous. If you live there next to the huge radon wells there, people living there are getting something like 130 millisieverts a year from natural radiation. There is a similar area in Japan. The doses are lower, but they're still up in the tens of millisieverts. The Misasa spa area, again, because of radon dissolved in spa waters. And in those areas, the natural dose is much higher than the natural plus accident dose in almost all of the exclusion zone around Fukushima. There's a little strip going to the northwest of the plant where the wind was blowing, where you could maybe argue either way, but actually in most of that area, you're not reaching anything like the levels you are at Misasa, let alone at these. And people obviously know that people are not evacuated from Misasa, and indeed, like an awful lot of these radon wells around the world, it is a health spa, and people positively seek out the opportunity to go and bathe in the waters. If you go on the web, you can find, particularly in the States, plenty of these radon spas where they are being advertised. We have we have a lot of radon in these waters. That's great for your health, and listing all the health benefits from that. I'm not sure I believe that either, but I don't believe that this is. But certainly people are not being excluded from those areas. So, how does the Japanese member of the public respond to this? Well, I guess, unless anyone come up with another, there's three possible explanations. First one is that the authorities are either mad or evil, because they've evacuated us from areas where the dose is at this level, but they don't evacuate people from areas where the dose is much higher, if natural and on the assumption, what they've just told us, that natural and man-made radiation are the same thing. Yeah, I just can't make sense of that if what they've just told me is true. Secondly then, perhaps they're just lying to us about the levels of contamination in the zone, trying to cover it up. That, I think, fits the facts that are being said. And the third one, though, is, but actually man-made radiation must be a lot more dangerous than natural radiation. That's why, in all of these cases, Chernobyl the same, they've evacuated people to avoid man-made radiation, but they wouldn't do the same for natural radiation. So in other words, what's coming up here is not that someone has gone around and told them natural radiation isn't as dangerous as man-made radiation. I think what's going on is this is an attempt to rationalise in their own mind, to find an explanation for what they have seen going on, which is this forcible exclusion coupled with much higher levels of natural radiation elsewhere. Indeed, the industry itself was going out and telling people the levels in the zone are much lower than the levels you can get in some natural areas, and nobody's worried about those natural levels, are they, as part of the communication argument. So let's assume that the Japanese nuclear power family is successful in persuading the media and the people that that man-made radiation and natural radiation are the same kind of thing. That doesn't lead to immediate relief, because, of course, the fundamental fact, these people are not allowed to go back to their homes, has not been changed by this. People still know that's happened, and they're then forced into one of the other two explanations. My suspicion, if I had to put money on it, was they would assume it was they were being lied to about the doses in the zone, rather than the true one, which is the authorities have gone stark staring mad by evacuating people at levels of man-made radiation that they would never dream of thinking about if it was natural radiation, because that just does not fit any rational approach towards what has actually happened. And as we've seen, it causes enormous damage. So I would suggest that, far from people being misinformed by malign influences, including the green movement and the media, what's actually going on is people are trying to make sense of what the authorities are actually doing in this situation. And I would say that is an awfully long way away from irrationality. That would seem to me the very definition of rationality. Bearing in mind, of course, that one can be perfectly rational but still incorrect if the premises that you've been given to make your rational decision happen to be incorrect. So, what I think follows from this is that just pumping people full of facts about how nuclear power, safe nuclear power is, might actually be counterproductive, particularly if it involves stressing the huge efforts and costs that are involved in nuclear safety. That message on nuclear safety, I think, is simply not credible. We shouldn't be surprised if the media reflect that in the way they report, because the media also has a duty to try to make sense of what they can see actually happening around them. It's worse than that almost, because in this room, I'm sure, just off the top of our heads, we could probably come up with 20 complex scientific issues that potentially have minor health effects. You already mentioned MMR, foam masks and genetically modified foods and so on. We could find plenty of those just in the scientific sphere, let alone all the things about our children's education, about the health service and so on and so forth. Why should people be so interested in radiation and nuclear power that they should devote the amount of headspace that would be needed to really get to grips with those issues, rather than spending that time thinking about health service or their children's education or MMR or that? I think the only reason that you could grab that amount of headspace and that amount of attention is by giving the impression this is so dangerous you really ought to know something about it. And goes back, therefore, you can only get that attention if you can create a credible reason there for people to hang their natural anxiety onto. And that, I'm afraid, is the philosophy that understands all of this talk about public education. It's the assumption that the people should be so worried about what's going on here. The industry would look at it the other way. It's so positive. But actually, we're far more attracted towards things that we think we ought to know about to protect ourselves, I think, when the industry starts to go on about safety in that sort of way. Of course, I'm not saying the industry ought to be secretive about it. If anybody is interested and asks a question, then that question should be answered. If incorrect information is in the media, that information should be challenged. I'm not saying that. But to lead with the chin is, I believe, inevitably going to have precisely the opposite effect that you thought it was. Some quite interesting... so firstly, it's just a non-starter to think that you could get to that level of understanding. And in practice, I said all that. This is... so not terribly visible, but some interesting work done at the University of Leeds, and this is around carbon capture and storage. They took a group of people who were vaguely interested, quite interested in environmental issues, but didn't know an awful lot about carbon capture and storage. And they asked them, this is associated with carbon capture and storage with gas or with coal, and asked them before starting, what's your broad attitude towards carbon capture and storage? And a certain number of them said that they were favourable, so around 25-30% were in favour of it. Around, rather smaller number were against it. Actually, no, when you add the two figures together, you're probably more or less in the same ballpark. But not far short of half of them, no particular opinion on it. They were then given a series of facts that were agreed by academics without a particular axe to grind, were a reasonable set of facts about what carbon capture and storage actually involved, why it was a good idea, what its challenges were, its difficulties and so on. And then they re-polled the people. What they found was that those who were in favour, described themselves as in favour, stayed in favour. In fact, if anything, became slightly more so. Those who were against stayed against, but most of those who didn't have an opinion had moved into the against camp. Now, there are other experiments that have been done don't show that as clearly, but it is clearly not the case that there's a direct correlation between giving people information and that leading to a change of attitude towards being in favour. Indeed, of course, the Green Movement spend a lot of time on education and are just as worried and keep wringing their hands about why the public is so rationally comfortable about radiation and nuclear power, when if only they knew the facts, they would be much more anti-nuclear. Now, obviously, you don't have to take a view on what facts are right or not right in this. It's just that there seems to be, it's quite likely that the very act of trying to give those facts is going to have more influence on the outcome than any content that you might actually be able to get over. So the alternative, and Pune got there actually, there was a lot of discussion in Pune about, why bother if a lot of people in the population just aren't interested in nuclear power and are very unlikely to be? Why is that a particular problem? Not everybody can be interested in everything. And I think one of the things, and Andrew was very instrumental in this, of recognising that the first thing to do in any programme like this is not make things worse. And sadly, almost every programme of this nature that's been done in the past has started off by making things worse and has often continued down that particular path. Say we don't know more often. Actually, I've done a little bit of work on Myers-Briggs. You know Myers-Briggs, the personality It's a sort of post-Jungian approach to personality. So it's a totally different lecture here. Jung differed from Freud. Where Jung and Freud fell out, as many of you will know, was that Freud believed that basically we're shaped by our environment. Jung believed far more of our personalities were actually fixed at birth and were immutable. A mother-daughter team, Myers and Briggs, developed Jung's work and looked at 4 parameters of our or continua of our personalities. One of which was introvert, extrovert. Do we get our energy and ideas from within ourselves or from our environment, basically? Sensing and intuition. Basically, are we sort of people who have the big ideas and then try and make the facts fit them, or do we build up our picture of the world from what comes in through our senses? There was one about how structured we are in our thinking. Do we try to control the world into a set of patterns, or do we allow the world to be as it is and enjoy things going wrong and so on? And the other one was whether we're basically driven by thinking and analysis, or by feelings and gut feelings. One of the systematic differences, there's quite a lot of systematic differences between scientists and the population at large, but one of the key ones is that actually scientists as a group tend to be much more likely to be J's, as it's called, tend to be structured, tend to like to have everything in quite a structured order. The population at large tends to be far more comfortable with things flowing and recognising that we can't understand everything and know everything, and that's fine. Sort of what we're doing as scientists, obviously, is trying to reduce that level of uncertainty. That's what the job's about. And that's why people with that personality type are drawn into it. It's not that being a scientist makes us like that. It's more having that sort of personality attracts us into, or so the theory goes, science. And so one of the points at which the communication may be breaking down is that people are much more comfortable with the kind of, we don't know, this is going, we're not quite sure where this is going as yet, than they are with people who say they know what's happening, particularly if then it doesn't happen. And of course, particularly when it comes to things like how long is this thing going to take to build, or how expensive is it going to be, an awful lot of very clear statements have been made which have turned out to be an awful long way away from reality. So I think there's something to be said for those communicating about these things to be a bit more comfortable with the idea, not feel that the public will be scared by the idea that we don't know everything, but actually out there, and certainly the general public at large tends to be rather more comfortable with that than maybe we are as scientists. Allow there to be other views, just engage honestly and accept downsides with that. More talk about the advantages, I think. Less use of the sort of the sort of high-ranking, always pretty much male, middle-aged white people. Industry's got much better than that. So I was saying, I'll come back to a moment of energy for that. And also building relationships. So I'm not saying go into a shell. I'm not saying don't talk about these things, but the proactive discussion needs to be far more about why. Take as its theme, more or less, a world with nuclear power is going to be a better one than a world without nuclear power, because people will be better off, rather than these machines are great, we're getting really close to them there, they're really fascinating with that. For some audiences that works really well, and that's the message that should be given. But for an awful lot of those, and as we're well aware, there is a massive gender difference in particular out there. Now I don't think that's because inherently men are pro-nuclear and women are anti-nuclear. I would bet if you took a poll of women engineers, you would find exactly the same attitude towards many of these things as you do among male engineers. I think it is more that the type of people who come into the industry are the type who are more fascinated by the machinery and the like than by the human angle. And with the that just happens to map onto male, female as it happens. But there are other communities. I did a bit of work with the acting community, for example, who are very, very anti-nuclear, generally speaking, with a few exceptions. Recognising that it's moving with the different personality types out there, and maybe not always being quite so machine focused. So making factual information available, challenging accuracies. I think we academics do have a role to play. I do a reasonable amount of media stuff. The media actually is fine with me saying I don't know something. During Fukushima, where I did a lot of on-screen work, never once was I held to account the next day for having got something wrong, because I was saying, we know so little of what's going on. I can give you an idea of what might be going on, and I guess 3/4 of the time what I was saying was more or less right, but 1/4 of the time it was way, way off, sometimes because I got it wrong and sometimes because we didn't have the information. Never got challenged for that, criticised for that. The media knew exactly this is the situation and we're very comfortable with that sort of communication. And remembering that, this was particularly the case during a crisis, that the way you are communicating is not just about giving a guide for action now. The way you communicate now will affect your relationships with stakeholders of various descriptions for years, if not decades, to come. And that, I think, is one of the great tragedies of the way the Japanese unfortunately dealt with it. I say things are much better. They are genuinely much better. EDF has stopped talking about how great nuclear is for a while, and has started creating, I'm sure you've seen Zingy, and Zingy appears in all sorts of huge orange fields where you've got to try and find it. And they sponsor things in the community and so on. And they're now just beginning in their communications to say, we are very low carbon, you might just be interested to know, that's because we use nuclear. It's actually quite interesting for those of you who want to talk about this. But it's not in that defensive mode of there's something wrong with you, you don't like us. It's like any other business, you don't have to know what we do, but like any other business, if you do find it interesting, we'd like to talk about it because we find it interesting as well. But it's a much more human connecting, this is just something you might be interested in, not that kind of, you've really got to understand how great this is coming here. And the attitude to, this is the actual nuclear new build. If you ask the general question, what's your attitude towards nuclear, the curve is the same. Back here, around 2000, at the time of the BNFL, those who are old enough in the tooth, BNFL had a big safety scandal about falsifying safety records of fuel they were saying to Japan. These figures were running around here at something like 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1 against. Now that's pretty much been reversed, and extraordinarily, although there was a dip after Fukushima, as far as we can tell, attitudes now are the same as they were pre-Fukushima. My feeling is actually that people now have seen a worked example in front of them. They have seen a major accident in plants that were 40, 50 years old in an area where they face the most extraordinary external threat. And still, the message, doesn't seem anybody's died from radiation, is getting out there. And ironically, I suspect that part of what is going on is that an example in front of them has helped to dispel some of the fears about radiation, because it's actually happened. I've no empirical evidence for that whatsoever. There is some work done by Nick Pidgeon at Cardiff that does suggest that there's something of that going on, however, and it certainly doesn't seem to me particularly unlikely. The very interesting thing I would like to do, I haven't got around to it yet, is plotting the amount of money the industry spent on public information through this period, because I reckon there is a direct and very strong positive, negative correlation between the amount you spend trying to persuade the people you're safe and how safe the people think you actually are. There's certainly a correlation. We can argue whether it's causative or not, but it's undoubtedly the case that around this time there were still quite large public information programs, the full-page adverts and so on. Through commercialisation and so on, that fell down, and it fell down more or less at the same rate as the opposition to nuclear power fell down. But, final thought, all these communication things I think can help, but none of them can work if we still continue to do very silly things and treat radiation as if it was vastly, vastly more dangerous than it actually is. And an awful lot of the heart of the problem goes round not to the fact that people haven't heard the messages. The problem is actually they have. It's just the words they haven't believed, but the actions they have. People know that we spend a vast, vast amount. We can't really afford to build nuclear power stations now. We've pretty much priced them out of the market. Now, those early figures in this slide show the most dangerous nuclear station is the one you don't build, because that's the one that kills thousands of people through coal or through gas or through climate change or for whatever sort of effect it is. That's the way really to damage people in the energy area. And yet, by rolling with this, in the bizarre hope that this will put people's minds at rest, we've actually ended up in an industry that's pretty much unfundable, maybe not quite, but getting that way, very closely getting that way, and which is falling through the most ridiculous hoops, which is slowing decision-making up hugely through all of this area. And while we continue to do that, I don't think we should be surprised if the problem gets worse rather than better. There is some helpful discussion around, as I say, the linear no threshold theory and around other things connected with it, arguing that it's time to get nuclear into perspective. And funnily enough, I think Fukushima aids that particular debate, not harms it. But I think it's important on all of us, even those of us who earn quite a lot of money out of the fact there's a nuclear debate. I wouldn't have a career if people weren't anti-nuclear, because I wouldn't get to come around and talk to people and persuade people it's worth paying me. But nonetheless, that's not really that's really a bit too high a price to pay for the lost potential that I think nuclear now represents in an awful lot of areas compared to what it could be doing. And that's something that you can't blame irrational people, you can't blame irrational media, you can't blame the Green Movement for that. That's something which lies firmly and squarely within the nuclear family, and that's where I think the solution lies as well.
Thank you for the informative and also entertaining talk. The presentation is open for discussion.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Enough material, far too much, for about 5 lectures, it seems to me. However, one particular point I'd like to raise is the one you talked about, radioactive waste. I thought the main worry with radioactive waste is the huge length of the half-lives of the materials that are in the waste. So it doesn't make sense to put them into a building next door to where people are working. The building might not be there in 1,000 years' time when the radioactive waste is still radioactive and still there. And that drove, surely, the decision to bury them a long way underground.
But based upon an assumption about what would happen if you didn't do that. And the difficulty is, I mean, of course, there are things out there with infinite half-life. You know, a lot of very unpleasant, stable materials. And one of the ironies is people seem to be more afraid of something which is, the language always is, it's dangerous for its half-life. You know, its half-life is always taken as the point. So something with a half-life of 250,000 years is dangerous for 250,000 years. Actually, as you and I know, the longer the half-life, the less toxic. It's the stuff with the 25, 30-year half-lives that we've really got to be careful about. It's the cesiums, the strontiums, because the short-lived, you know, iodine-131 an exception, but that's all gone from the environment in 3 months, as long as you protect yourself. So the short-lived ones, horrendous, but they're not around for long. The long-lived ones, around for a long time, but the dose they're giving is very low. So it's the medium-level ones you'd be concerned about. But we seem to have got into this idea, and no threshold theory is part of it, that every little bit of radiation is dangerous. Converting that into every bit of radiation is seriously dangerous. If we had taken as a start, we're going to apply the same level of safety about radioactive waste as we do about chemical waste and so on, and with the same level of protection, then, you know, frankly, there's an awful lot of radioactive waste as it's produced, but certainly after 10 or 20 years, I'd be much happier eating than I'd be happy eating asbestos or PCBs or some of these other things, which we don't bury 800 metres underground in the same sort of way. So you're right, that was the second level argument, but the problem was the first level argument of, and the problem is, radiation is so desperately dangerous. We know that with doses of 100 millisieverts over a year, or 50 millisieverts in a single dose, that's associated with high levels of cancer. Below that, we don't know. Now, I don't think there's anywhere in the evacuation zone anything like 100 millisieverts a year around Fukushima. The worst area is around 20, I think. We haven't got the evidence. Now, I don't mind a bit of saying, well, we'll assume that it's dangerous down to 50 or 20, but when we start saying it's dangerous down to 0.1, and these were the criteria, you know, in 10,000 years, we don't want anybody to get a dose similar to the natural background that we know doesn't do them any harm, because we know cancer rates in Cornwall are no different from what they are in London. That's where the problem where the problem really arose. Now, I'm not against safety as such, I hope you say there, but I don't want us to be spending money on burying stuff underground, which we could be spending in hospitals or in cancer research or almost anything else that you think of that would have a better benefit for mankind.
Can I add a modifier to the statement? The half-life says, it doesn't say anything about the chemical toxicity. What you were talking about is the radiotoxicity. Those are 2 different things.
Yeah.
You started your talk saying you couldn't run an experiment by changing a variable in 1970, I think you said. But one of the areas you haven't addressed, seems to me, if anybody joining the nuclear industry in 1970 had to sign the Official Secrets Act. And you haven't addressed the issue as to why the public may be suspicious. Because the origins of this industry are totally involved with the ideas of with issues of secrecy.
I think that's right, and I think that the military link in the early days, something I have to say, it's something I very, very rarely hear when talking in schools or with people of a certain age. That particular link doesn't seem to be as strong as it was when I first started getting involved in this in the 80s. But then we still come back to the idea of saying we still need to explain these anomalies around the public attitudes towards radiation from other sources. That might be part of the explanation, but there are plenty of other industries which also have been very secretive, which don't seem to have quite that flavour of objection around it as we find with nuclear. So I think you're right. I think that's another factor within the whole thing. And I'm not trying to say that what I'm giving you is the only factor. I think the Slovak factors are relevant as well. It's undoubtedly a very complex situation. But I think there are some anomalies that are not completely explained by any single strand of these explanations. But yeah, I certainly take your point. That early military link is relevant, I think.
What's the next? And then in the back.
Nuclear fission, power generation came on the back of nuclear weapons. Because of the threat from the Soviet Empire, we obviously had to have nuclear weapons. And a lot of work on nuclear power was done in the shadow. And a lot of the safety factors with nuclear power are basically overlooked because of the need for nuclear weapons. When you look at nuclear fission, its main product is superheated steam to turn turbines and produce electricity. In the last 60 years, we've found many other ways of turning those turbines and producing that electricity. With nuclear fission, of course, we do have a very dangerous fuel, and we produce a very dangerous waste. And when you talk about half-life, we have to put it somewhere away from people. We've also only seen the nuclear dragon whisper so far at places like 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. Now, and there's also the problem that nuclear fuel supplies come from quite a long way away in the event of a national emergency. There are some serious fuel supply problems, albeit we do have these reactors. But as an engineer, I've always been taught to look at what it does, what it costs, what else will do it. And if you put that argument to nuclear power, or to power generation, I would suggest that the modern alternatives give us a system which don't have the safety concerns or the cost and will produce gigawatts far sooner than the next generation of nuclear power stations, which I believe are a total waste of money. And as well as that, they are actually going to be owned by foreign companies. So a national strategic asset like the power station is actually going to be in foreign hands, possibly Chinese money behind it. Not the most sensible strategic approach.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal feelings on that. I do think there are issues around Chinese ownership, actually. I think there will be public issues around that. I think that's an issue which is going to have to be looked at. I mean, the evidence shows that the one period when we were reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and reducing carbon from energy was between 75 and 95. If you look at the percentage of traded primary energy that comes from oil, coal and gas, it was a very constant 94% from up to around 1975, with hydro being the other tranche. Dropped to 87%, that's only a doubling of the non-fossil fortune, but nonetheless it dropped to 87% by 1995. And it has been exactly on 87% plus or minus half a percentage point since 1995. The facts of the matter are that nuclear is the only technology so far which has been shown that we can develop it fast enough to make a significant difference in carbon. Renewables haven't shown that. We can certainly build renewable capacity very quickly. What we can't do, because of the variability issue, is produce useful renewable output at that rate. And so an increasing proportion of renewable output is actually wasted, or in many cases a good of negative value, which has to be vented onto the system. You get the crazy situation that at the times of peak demand, in the winter when there's no wind, offshore wind farms are a significant addition to the load because they have to be kept turning so they don't freeze up, and they increase that. So the variability issue, I don't think, is something that we can ignore. I mean, as you will know, there were 6 million wind generators in the USA in the year 1900. It was one of the first sources of electricity. As soon as Roosevelt electrified rural America and there was access to non-variable electricity, within a decade, wind power fell away from being never in the hydro scene and so on. And so I take the point, you look at the alternatives. Actually, we've got far longer experience of the renewables than we have of nuclear. And we know, I think we know, that the only way they can be made to work is by very, very large subsidies up front. Coupled with the hidden subsidies, they don't have to pay for the grid that has to be added onto the dispatchable grid, and they don't have to pay for the non-system effects, the capacity payments we're now having to pay coal and gas stations to keep operating because of that. And coupled with all of that, and with some of the environmental stuff, I'd like to think renewables could do all of this. But I think we've actually got a vast amount of evidence to suggest that they are too problematic to make a significant difference to what's going on in fossil fuels. Now, that might be wrong, and if that's wrong, brilliant. But I think with all these things, you hope for the best, but at the same time, you've really got to prepare for the worst.
I think the point you're missing with renewables is that the money that we need to spend now is on energy storage, pumped storage, water electrolysis, producing storage of energy when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. There's an engineering challenge there, which Germany has welcomed with open arms in generating methods to actually achieve successful energy storage. Young engineers going into degree courses today find an exciting future building an energy storage system to go alongside renewables that will give us power generation not for 60 years as you're talking with these new reactors, but for the next 600 years.
But
Falling back if we need to on clean coal and CCS, as you mentioned earlier. We're sitting on 600 years supply of coal, which can be made clean coal without the dangers of nuclear fission.
Well, I mean, just very briefly, as you know, 99% of the world's storage capacity is pumped storage, and there are significant environmental challenges around expanding that very, 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 very significantly. As you also know, the first electricity used to generate hydrogen was in the 1890s as a way of dealing with this. These are very, very old ideas which have never been made to work, despite having well over a century of research. We might just be about to find the real breakthrough. And the broad theory out there, which is we deliberately used all the really awful ways of making energy first and kept the really good ones to the end, might or might not be the case. I'm just a little bit worried as to whether we put too much of our future within that. And the same goes for storage. You know, storage, when did Volta invent the battery? 1800? That this is not either a new challenge or a new technology. Some sorts of breakthroughs are happening, but we're still bashing our head against the second law, always against the second law. You know, Merkel's basic energy policy is that she's going to repeal the second law of thermodynamics.
We have at least 15 years to develop those before you see the first watt come out of these new power plants.
I would add that the storage that Germany is one of the storage capacities that they're looking into are spin-offs from nuclear, the molten salts they're looking at. And if we didn't have the research capacity in Germany that did that, they'd be far behind. So they're profiting from the nuclear legacy. So I'm going to, next question, yes.
Thank you. I just have a question about the nuclear waste, because as far as I'm concerned, the nuclear energy is expanding in China very quickly, and they are building the reactors much more than already existed. So the nuclear waste will increasing very, very quickly. I was studying on the cement, on the nuclear waste immobilization, but the problem is, as far as I research on the papers, I know that the nuclear waste is increasing far more than we can handle, so we can only dispose them. Do you think this will be a main concern in the future for the people to worry about the safety of nuclear industry, because they are worried about where the nuclear waste can be handled properly?
Two rather different questions in there, I think. In terms of waste, my own belief is that you can dry store spent fuel on the surface or close to the surface, and that's probably all you need to do with it, is allow it, with passive cooling to stay cool, to happen there. I don't see an immediate need to deal with it, and you can do that in very significant. And as you know, one of the issues of China obviously is your massive population, but there are many areas of China which are very sparsely populated, which may help the public angle with that. In terms of the wider issue, I think you can more or less identify three stages, I think, in the relationship between the technical, the political and the public spheres. Phase one is one where they all really get on well. So people trust their politicians, people trust industry, industry and politicians trust each other. You can get a lot of decisions taken in those times. They're not necessarily very good decisions all the time because they don't get much scrutiny, but you can take decisions. Then people begin to realise that industry can lie or get things wrong, politicians can lie or get things wrong, and you develop a very fractious stage where almost all the three bits of that tripartite relationship fall apart. So people stop trusting. You get the growth of the decline of deference, the growth of satire, and so on. People don't trust their politicians. They don't trust their industry, and industry and politics begin to fall out for the same reason. And then I think there's a third potential phase where people start to realise that the Green movement becomes really popular in those times. The anti-politicians become popular. You then get to a third stage where people realise that the Greens are just as likely to lie or get things wrong as industry is, so people stop believing as a matter of faith. You almost move from a religious phase where on several occasions I have challenged, just said there are problems with wind and explain what they are, and someone has said, but you are anti-wind. And that's the end of the argument. You are a heretic. We don't have to go any further to explain what you've said. The fact you are anti-wind means your views on wind don't have to be listened to at all. And that people, I think, get fed up with that. So you move to what I think in some ways we might be moving towards, which is a healthy scepticism towards environmentalism or the anti-industry industry and towards industry itself. And potentially you could move into a world where in the first phase, you take lots of decisions, but quite a lot of them aren't very good, and some of the early nuclear decisions absolutely fit into that category. To a world where we still more or less are, that you can't take any decisions at all of any description, because somebody will have a way of stopping you doing it. And anyway, very often, because you've liberalised your markets, nobody knows what a decision is or who's responsible for taking it. But maybe then you move into a third phase, that you can start taking decisions again. People realise you've got to do something, but those decisions get much better scrutiny. So there isn't an absolute, we want to stop everything, but there is but we're not going to give you an absolute card. Now, my suspicion is the UK may be edging into that third phase. Obviously, politically, we're still in the anti-politician phase, but in some of the way the Green movement now gets criticism, I think we might be moving towards a third phase. I think an interesting question in different ways for China and for Japan are that I think Japan was still in the first phase around Fukushima. Had a decade of TEPCO doing the most extraordinarily awful things, including having to close their whole fleet for 2 years because of falsification, and still getting away with it. Now, the Japanese are just far too polite to have high technology in their industries, one can argue. Now I think the Japanese are getting ruder. I think they're beginning to be quite fractious. That's a really good thing. And the question there is, how long will it take for them to get through that second phase? To get to a position where their establishment is properly challenged. China fascinates me. I mean, I gather you do now have a lot of public protests about things in China. It's just beginning to develop, but clearly the way the iron fist of the politics has been managed, it still looks from the outside as very much as if people don't get much of a chance to challenge the decisions that are being made at the top. And I think the reforms in the Communist Party at the moment are probably moving back in the other direction more than moving forward to stage two. So, two sorts of questions. Radioactive waste itself as an issue has never worried me all that much, but it's a really fascinating issue as to how China manages this massive economic development in some parts of the country with all the increased education and increased opportunity to interact that brings with it, with a political system which for some quite good reasons, but may not be sustainable in the long term. And then potentially you could have a massive rejection by the Chinese people of all sorts of things, which would be a very, very interesting phase to look at.
So there was a question here, and then there was a question here, and then we will see. Yes, sir.
You've been describing a situation where, in your view, the general public's estimate of the risks of nuclear power is greatly over-exaggerated. In my view, exactly a similar situation in reverse exists concerning climate change, where the general public's view of the risk of climate change is greatly underestimated. Can you comment?
That's one of the most fascinating questions. Again, in the Slovak terms, we can't detect carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's a relatively new, I know the science goes back to Fourier, but it's a relatively new, the people are talking about it. It's clearly outside the control of any individual, and it could potentially affect everybody, including future generations. So by the Slovak factors, this ought to be right at the very top of concerns. And I think that's really interesting. My instinct is maybe that there comes a point where the threat becomes too serious to be credible. What we would have to give up in terms of doing anything serious about climate change is so psychologically frightening that it will blow the circuits on anxiety, as it were. If we had a realistic fear of climate change, I don't see how any of us could get out of bed in the morning, because it's, as we know, it's basically it's the prisoner's dilemma of our time. It's if everybody does something about it, we're all better off, but it's in nobody's interest to do anything about it, because if everybody else is doing something about it, a single country can freeload and get huge advantages out of that. If nobody else is doing anything about it, a country just cuts its own economic throat by doing something about it unilaterally. So all of these things, I think, ironically, it may mean that you can get to a point where the threat is so big that it doesn't fit the background anxiety. It would actually, there's a lot of psychological research showing that we are actually inherently more optimistic than our circumstances around us actually should benefit. Some of that might seem to clash with some of the anxiety things I'm talking about, but it does seem to be an element out there that the level of anxiety that we set for ourselves unconsciously is, for most people, a slightly optimistic one, because otherwise we'd just crack up in terms of all the problems for the future, perhaps. I don't know. I would say those are the areas where I am least sure about what I'm saying, and most want to go and carry out some of the experiments there, or do some more of the work on that.
Right. I enjoyed your talk very much. I worked in a different side of health and safety for about 11 years in this university, retiring 8 years ago. And it was interesting to compare the radiological side with my area, which was biological safety, and it included both things which were naturally infectious, but also things which probably weren't infectious, which were genetically modified. And the attitudes of people working in the lab were very interesting. There's a lab within a mile of here, and it had its own cafeteria in there. And one day I went in, and there's a big sign up. We guarantee that no genetically modified foods will be served in this establishment. So I got in conversation with some of my colleagues there, and most of them were a bit horrified at the idea they might serve them there. I said, well, you're earning a living doing this sort of thing. You're trying to produce new drugs and vaccines and things like that, using these techniques which would put things into people whose health is probably not 100%, otherwise why would you be putting them in? Why would you be worried about eating them? I said, well, it's not natural, is it? I said, well, the things they serve here now are not natural. They're not the foodstuffs they would have served 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Because from about the 18th century onwards, there was a lot of selection of strains and breeds by using traditional means of plant breeding and animal breeding. They're totally different things out in the wild. The difference between what's being done now is that these people for the previous 200 years were doing things and just looking at the product and seeing if it did what they wanted it to do. And some of these breeds, particularly animals, had defects which were not desired, but were put up with because of the improvements in other aspects. So the difference is now, if you're using modern genetic modification techniques, you target individual genes that you can modify, and you have a pretty good idea of what they're doing, and you check to make sure that this has happened. And they said, well, no, we still wouldn't trust it. I said, well, what if they had a daily special, which was clearly labelled? And I said, I would eat it. I'd be the first person to have a portion if it was from something which was known and properly tested. Oh no, I said, there might be contamination we'd carry home to our children. We're not going to kill our children this way. Now, isn't that an attitude for people who are earning their living doing this in a lab? I invite your comments.
It is fascinating. I mean, my GMO is certainly not my field, but my impression is that the first real start of backlash against the Greens, maybe not the first, but a really important one, was MMR. I think that was one where an awful lot of people started to realise, well, actually, these manufactured scares are not cost-free. As you let us know, we've now got over 2,000 measles cases a year. It was down in double figures before the Wakefield fiction. It's now up in four figures, and there was a beginning of a bit of a backlash there. I think GMO might be the second, because, well, actually, already nuclear might be the second, looking at those figures.
Yes.
But I think with GMOs, it's another one there where there is actually. And in a sense, you know, for countries like ours, fine, but there's a big debate now around some of the childhood diseases in developing countries, where, and obviously particularly starvation, where GMOs could be making, you know, difference of tens, hundreds of thousands of lives a year. And there is a kind of a backlash saying, you know, based on science which doesn't really back up with what you were saying, that the costs of this are really very significant. And I think as society, that's what I mean about moving into a stage where people are realising we can't just get by without taking any sorts of decisions. Eventually we have to start doing something new, if only what the new we're doing is replacing the stuff that we used to have that's wearing out. But actually some of these new techniques coming along, maybe we've got a duty to use them, not just a duty to not use them, and those duties need to be balanced. Yeah. So I think that is part of the emerging phase 3 debate that's going on in the UK, and I'd certainly like to feel. I remember, just as very quick anecdote before we finish, when I had the education chair in local authority, one of the local Green Party wrote to me and said, saying she hoped we wouldn't use GMO in school lunches, and she said the same scientists who are now saying GMO is safe were the same people who were saying that Chernobyl couldn't happen. And I wrote back and said, can you give me the names of a few of the scientists who said both of those things? But it was very, very characteristic of that second phase, where if a single scientist has ever said, I can't find anybody in the UK who did say Chernobyl can't happen. I found the Ellerly's report in '76 that says it could, but I've not seen anything that said it couldn't. But even if there was somebody who said Chernobyl couldn't happen, the idea, therefore, that proves that all scientists in the future cannot be trusted, was, I think, a crystallisation of how second phase societies work, where the whole enterprise of science has to be rejected. So what's actually going on is not just about GMO, it's something to do with the scientific development, and scientific developments per se are not to be trusted. And I think we've actually, as a society, come quite a long way since those. I don't think I'd get a letter like that today. Whether we've gone far enough, because there's such a desperate need, particularly in energy, to start taking decisions and start getting on with stuff, I don't know. But I think that my feeling is the attitude in GMO might be an example that discussion might go a little bit differently if you're having it today.
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to defer further discussion. There's tea outside in front of where the elevators are. And so everyone's welcome to join for tea and continue the discussion. And let us thank our speaker one more time.